Desperate leopard cubs beg a German shepherd, and what happened next was heartbreaking. On a stormy night in the mountains, 3 starving cubs cling to the one protector they should fear. But instead, the dog refuses to let them go. At first, it looks like a strange act of survival. But soon, the man who takes them in discovers this was no accident. Someone wanted these cubs go-nazed. And the truth behind their cries hides a secret darker than the wilderness itself. Why were they left to die? What danger is closing in on the man who dared to protect them? And when the predator turns out to be human, who will make it out alive? Before we begin, tell me your city or country in the comments. It turns this space from a screen into a circle of real hearts. The Montana wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows of Clint Harkness's remote cabin. Rain pelted against the tin roof in an endless drumbeat as he stood at his kitchen counter, methodically cleaning his hunting rifle. His German shepherd Barrow lay nearby on his worn bed, ears perking up at every crack of thunder. Clint's weathered hands moved with practiced precision over the weapon. At 53, his fingers still remembered every lesson from his army days, even if his joints now protested more than they used to. A flash of lightning illuminated the cabin's sparse interior, casting harsh shadows across the wooden walls. "What do you think, boy?" Clint's gravelly voice broke the silence. "Should we do one last perimeter check before turning in?" Barrow's tail thumped against his bed, and he rose immediately, his military training showing in his alert posture. Despite the scars that marked his muscular body, souvenirs from their time in Afghanistan, the shepherd moved with fluid grace. Clint pulled on his heavy rain jacket and grabbed his flashlight. Let's make it quick. Together, they stepped out into the tempest. The beam of Clint's flashlight cut through the darkness as they made their way along their usual patrol route. The trees groaned under the wind's assault, and mud sucked at their boots and paws. Halfway through their circuit, Barrow suddenly stopped. His ears shot forward, and his body tensed. Clint knew that posture. He'd seen it countless times during their deployments. Something was out there. "What is it, boy?" Clint whispered, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol at his hip. Then he heard it, a sound that seemed impossible in these woods. A high-pitched mewling, barely audible above the storm. It wasn't the cry of any animal that should be in these mountains. Barrow moved forward, his nose working overtime, leading Clint deeper into the tree line. The flashlight beam bounced off wet leaves and branches until it finally landed on something that made Clint's breath catch in his throat. 3 tiny leopard cubs, huddled together under a fallen log, their spotted coats soaked through. They couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, their eyes huge and frightened in their small faces. "Dear God," Clint muttered, moving closer. The cubs shrunk back, but then something extraordinary happened. Barrow, moving with incredible gentleness for a dog his size, approached the cubs. Instead of showing fear, the little leopards actually pressed toward him, seeking his warmth. Clint's mind raced. Leopards weren't native to Montana. These cubs had to have been born in captivity. But where was their mother? A K. And who would abandon baby leopards in the middle of nowhere during a storm? The smallest cub let out another pitiful cry, and Clint's heart clenched. These babies wouldn't survive the night in this weather. He knew taking in wild animals was illegal, but leaving them to die wasn't an option his conscience would allow. "Okay, little ones," he said softly, removing his rain jacket. "Let's get you somewhere warm." With Barrow's calming presence, Clint managed to gather all 3 cubs in his jacket. They were frighteningly light, their ribs prominent under their wet fur. One of them sneezed, a tiny sound that seemed to echo Clint's worst fears about their condition. The walk back to the cabin seemed longer, each step careful to avoid jostling his precious cargo. Barrow stayed close, occasionally touching his nose to the bundle when one of the cubs would whimper. Inside the cabin, Clint's military training kicked in. Assess the situation. Address immediate needs. Form a plan. He grabbed old towels from his linen closet and created a makeshift nest near the wood stove. As he gently dried each cub, he could feel their rapid heartbeats under his hands. "They're starving," he murmured to Barrow, who hadn't left the cub's side. "We need to get some food into them, and fast." Clint heated some milk on the stove, remembering what he'd learned about caring for young animals during his years in the mountains. Using an eyedropper from his first aid kit, he carefully fed each cub. Their eagerness to eat confirmed his fears about how long they'd been without food, as the cubs finally drifted off to sleep. Huddled against Barrow's warm body, Clint sat back in his chair and ran a hand over his face. The scar on his jaw, a reminder of his last deployment, seemed to ache with the weight of his decision. These cubs weren't just lost, they were evidence of something criminal. In his gut, he knew this wasn't a simple case of exotic pets abandoned by an overwhelmed owner. The cub's condition, the remote location, the timing during a storm when no one would be around, it all pointed to something more sinister. Barrow looked up at him, his intelligent eyes seeming to ask what they were going to do next. Clint reached down to scratch behind his faithful companion's ears. "Looks like our quiet life just got complicated, boy," he said softly, watching the tiny rises and falls of the cubs' chests as they slept. "But we can't just look the other way, can we?" The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, 3 orphaned cubs had found an unlikely sanctuary with a retired soldier and his loyal shepherd. Clint didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for tonight he had 3 new charges to protect, and that was enough. Clint sat in his worn leather chair, watching the leopard cubs sleep against Barrow's warm fur. The German shepherd hadn't moved an inch, seeming to understand these tiny creatures needed his protection. But something about this situation wasn't sitting right with Clint. "Leopards in Montana," he muttered, running his fingers over the scar on his jaw. "Makes about as much sense as palm trees in Alaska." He pulled out his old laptop, its screen casting a blue glow across the cabin's wooden walls. His fingers moved across the keyboard, searching for any news about missing exotic animals. In the region, nothing recent showed up, not even in neighboring states. Barrow's ears perked up as one of the cubs stirred, letting out a tiny mewl. The dog's response was immediate. A gentle nuzzle, a soft whine, and the cub settled back to sleep. Clint watched. In amazement, Barrow had been trained as a combat dog, yet here he was, playing nursemaid to 3 baby leopards. "You're full of surprises, aren't you, boy?" Clint said softly. Barrow's tail thumped once against the floor in response. The storm had settled into a steady drizzle, and first light wasn't far off. Clint knew he needed to investigate while the tracks were still fresh. He pulled on his boots and weatherproof jacket, checking his pistol out of habit. "Stay with them," he told Barrow, who didn't need to be told twice. The dog adjusted his position slightly, creating a more protective circle around the sleeping cubs. Outside, the air was heavy with moisture. Clint clicked on his tactical flashlight, its beam cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. 20 years in the Army had taught him how to read signs others might miss. And what he saw troubled him deeply. The tracks leading to where he'd found the cubs weren't random. They were deliberate. Someone had carefully chosen that spot. Fallen log provided just enough shelter to keep the cubs alive for a short while, but hidden enough that most people would never find them. "Too perfect," Clint mumbled, crouching to examine the ground more closely. The mud held clear boot prints, expensive hiking boots, not the work boots most locals wore. And there were tire tracks on the service road half a mile away, fresh ones, that shouldn't be there. This wasn't some overwhelmed exotic pet owner dumping unwanted animals. The precision of it all spoke of organization, of planning. The storm hadn't been a coincidence either. It had been cover for whoever left the cubs. Clint followed the tracks backward, noting how they avoided the clearer paths where cameras might be mounted by park services. Whoever did this knew the area, knew how to stay hidden. Back in the cabin, he found Barrow still maintaining his protective watch. The largest cub had wrapped its tiny paw around one of the dog's legs, holding on, even in sleep. The sight would have been heartwarming if the implications weren't so disturbing. Clint pulled out his notebook, the same one he'd used to document suspicious activities during his military days. He began writing everything down: the boot sizes, the tire treads, the precise location. His training wouldn't let him overlook any detail. "This was planned," he said to Barrow, who watched him with intelligent eyes. "They wanted these cubs found, but not too soon. Question is, why? The cubs would need proper care soon, more than what he could provide with heated milk and an eyedropper. But taking them to authorities would mean questions he couldn't answer. Yet, worse, it might alert whoever left them that their plan had been discovered. Clint checked his phone. He still had contacts from his Army days, people who dealt with wildlife trafficking. But making those calls would mean stepping back into a world he'd left behind, trading his peaceful retirement for something more dangerous. The smallest cub woke up, crying softly. Clint watched as Barrow immediately began gently cleaning its face with his tongue, the tiny leopard settling under the dog's attention. These cubs trusted them now. They were depending on them. Looking at his scarred hands, Clint remembered the promise he'd made after his last tour. No more battles, no more risks. But staring at those 3 helpless cubs, he knew he couldn't just walk away. Someone had orchestrated this, and their plan probably involved more than just 3 abandoned leopard cubs. "Looks like retirement's over, boy," Clint said to Barrow. The dog's ears perked up, as if he understood the weight of those words. "We've got work to do." The morning sun was starting to peek through the windows, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. Clint knew that somewhere out there, people were counting on these cubs not being found in time, or being found by someone who wouldn't ask questions. They hadn't counted on a retired Army canine handler and his loyal shepherd, the Montana. Wildlife Services office sat at the edge of town, a weathered building that had seen better days. Clint parked his truck in the nearly empty lot, double-checking that Barrow was comfortable watching the cubs hidden in the truck's extended cab. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked pavement as he made his way to the entrance. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A tired-looking receptionist pointed him to Ward Officer Kane's office without looking up from her computer. The nameplate on the door read Marjorie Kane, Senior Wildlife Officer, in simple black letters. Clint knocked twice, hearing a firm come in from the other side. The office was smaller than he expected, but organized with military precision. Maps covered one wall, with pins marking various locations. The woman behind the desk stood as he entered. She was lean and weathered, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything about him in seconds. "Officer Kane," Clint said, extending his hand. "I'm Clint Harkness. I have something you need to see." Marjorie's handshake was firm. "The canine handler who lives up near Parker Creek. I've heard about you." She gestured to a chair. "What brings you out of your solitude?" Clint placed his notebook on her desk, along with the photos he'd taken on his phone. 3 leopard cubs were deliberately abandoned near my property last night. The tracks, the timing with the storm, none of it was random. He expected dismissal or skepticism. Instead, Marjorie leaned forward, her attention completely focused as he laid out his findings. She asked precise questions about the boot prints, the tire tracks, the cub's condition. Her eyes narrowed at certain details. "You're right," she said finally. "This wasn't random. And you're not the first to bring me concerns about exotic animals in the area." She stood, walking to her map wall. "See these pins? Each one represents a reported sighting of animals that shouldn't be here. tigers, lions, rare breeds. But whenever we investigate, the evidence disappears. Someone's protecting the operation, Clint said, connecting the dots. Marjorie's jaw tightened. Russell Kettering. He owns half the county, runs legitimate hunting tours on his massive ranch. But I've had suspicions about his operation for years. Exotic game hunts for elite clients off the books. The kind of people who pay hundreds of thousands to shoot a rare animal. And no one stopped him. Can't prove it. Every time I get close, evidence vanishes. Witnesses change their stories. My superiors suddenly decide to redirect resources elsewhere. Her frustration was evident in every word. Kettering has friends in high places. Money talks. Clint stood, moving to study the map. These cubs weren't meant to survive. They were insurance, weren't they? Something went wrong with the shipment? A distraction. Marjorie nodded. While authorities chase down reports of abandoned cubs, the real cargo moves elsewhere. We've seen similar tactics before. Clint rubbed the scar on his jaw, a habit from his military days. I came here hoping this was simple poaching. Something local law enforcement could handle. Nothing simple when Kettering's involved. Marjorie's voice was bitter. Last month, one of my junior officers got too close to his operation. 2 days later, photos surfaced of him accepting bribes. The photos were faked, but his career was over. Clint thought of the cubs in his truck, of Barrow's protective instincts toward them. He'd promised himself no more battles, no more causes. But walking away now felt impossible. The cubs need proper care, he said, but turning them over to authorities, would alert Kettering that someone's onto his game. Marjorie finished. She seemed to make a decision. I have contacts at a private wildlife sanctuary. They're discreet, experienced with big cats. The cubs would be safe there. And while they're being cared for, we gather proof, real proof, the kind that even Kettering's money can't make disappear. She met his eyes. I'm not asking you to jump back into the fight, Mr. Harkness, but you have skills I need. Tracking, surveillance, the ability to move unnoticed. And most importantly, you're not on anyone's payroll. Clint thought of his peaceful cabin, the quiet life he'd built. Then, he remembered the deliberate cruelty of abandoning those cubs, using them as pawns in a larger game. His hands clenched involuntarily. Kettering's operation is growing. Marjorie continued. More animals, bigger shipments. Someone's going to get hurt, human or animal. We might be the only ones in a position to stop it. I work alone, Clint said. Learned that the hard way. So did I. Marjorie replied. Look how far that's gotten us both. She had a point. Clint had seen enough corruption in his military days to recognize the pattern. Sometimes the only way to fight a broken system was from the outside. The cubs go to the sanctuary first, he said finally. Then we talk strategy. And if I think, for 1 second, that this is going sideways, you walk away? Marjorie nodded. I understand. She wrote down an address and a contact name for the sanctuary. As Clint turned to leave, she added, Thank you for bringing this to me. Most people would have looked the other way. Clint paused at the door. Most people didn't spend 20 years seeing what happens when good people look the other way. The morning sun was higher now as he walked back to his truck. Barrow's tail thumped against the seat in greeting. In the back, 3 leopard cubs slept peacefully, unaware that their fate had just been decided. The forest seemed different now, that Clint knew what lurked within it. Every shadow held potential threats as he moved cautiously through the trees, checking his property's perimeter. Barrow padded silently beside him, the German shepherd's ears constantly moving, alert to any unusual sounds. A twig snapped in the distance. Clint froze, his hand dropping to Barrow's collar. Through the dense pines, he caught glimpses of movement. men in camouflage, carrying rifles that were definitely not standard hunting gear. Their methodical search pattern spoke of military training down, Clint whispered to Barrow. They pressed against a fallen log as two men passed barely 30 feet away. "Nothing here," one man muttered into a radio. "Moving to Sector 4. "Keep searching," crackled the response. "Boss wants those cats found today." Clint's jaw tightened. They were Kettering's men. Had to be. He waited until they moved on before carefully backing away. The cubs were safely hidden in a root cellar behind his cabin, a precaution that now seemed prescient rather than paranoid as darkness fell. Clint sat by his cabin window, watching. Barrow lay at his feet, occasionally, lifting his head to sniff the air. The cubs were quiet below, but Clint could hear their occasional mewling. The attack came just after midnight. Barrow's growl woke him seconds before the first. Molotov cocktail crashed through his front window. Flames erupted instantly, catching the old wood. Another bottle smashed through the kitchen window, then another. The cabin filled with smoke and heat with terrifying speed. "Barrow, come," Clint shouted, dropping to his hands and knees. The German Shepherd stuck close as they crawled toward the back door. Outside, he could hear engines running multiple vehicles. This was no random attack. They burst out the back door into clean air. Clint's lungs burned as he gasped. But there was no time to recover. The cubs. He had to reach the root cellar before the attackers found it. A bullet sparked off a rock near his head. Clint dove behind a stack of firewood as more shots rang out. Barrow pressed against him, teeth bared at the darkness. "We know you have them," a voice called out. "Just walk away, old man. This doesn't have to get worse." Clint's response was to grab a burning piece of wood and hurl it toward the voices. The sudden light revealed three men ducking for cover. More importantly, it showed him they were focused on the cabin's front, leaving the path to the root cellar relatively clear. "Barrow, distract," Clint commanded. The shepherd immediately began barking and running toward the tree line, drawing fire. Clint used the confusion to sprint to the root cellar's concealed entrance. The cubs huddled together in the corner, terrified by the noise but alive. Clint quickly wrapped them in an old blanket, forming a makeshift sling. Above, he could hear his cabin's roof beginning to collapse. "Come on, little ones," he whispered, gathering them close. Time to disappear. He waited for Barrow's next volley of barking, then emerged from the cellar. The German Shepherd was leading the attackers on a chase through the woods. But they'd figure out the deception soon. Clint moved as quickly as he dared through the darkness. The cubs weighed awkward against his chest. He knew these woods better than anyone, every hidden wash, every game trail. He'd chosen this land specifically because it connected 2 miles of wilderness behind him. His cabin became a funeral pyre, flames reaching into the night sky. 20 years of peaceful solitude gone in minutes. But as one of the cubs nuzzled against his neck, seeking comfort, Clint felt something crystallize inside him. He'd tried to stay neutral, to mind his own business. But Kettering had brought the war to his doorstep, had tried to burn him out like a rat. It's the old soldier in him, the part he'd tried to bury under years of quiet, stirred to life. Barrow materialized out of the darkness, pressing against Clint's leg. Together, they moved deeper into the forest as shots and shouts faded behind them. Kettering's men would find nothing but ashes when they searched the ruins. Dawn found them miles away. Sheltering in a hidden ravine Clint had scouted years ago as a possible fallback position, old habits died hard. The cubs were sleeping, curled against Barrow's warm fur. Clint watched the eastern sky lighten, its expression hard. He'd spent years running from conflict, telling himself he'd seen enough violence for one lifetime. But sometimes, he realized, neutrality itself became a form of surrender. Kettering had forced his hand, thinking to eliminate a nuisance. Instead, he'd awakened something far more dangerous, a warrior who now had nothing left to lose. Clint pulled out his phone, one of the few things he'd grabbed before fleeing. Time to call Marjorie. The game had changed, and they needed to move. Fast Kettering had shown his hand, revealing just how far he'd go to protect his operation. The sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire that matched the distant smoke column from Clint's burning cabin. The cubs stirred, hungry and afraid. Barrow licked them gently, offering what comfort he could. "It's all right," Clint told them softly, his voice rough from the smoke. "We're not running anymore. Not from this." The morning after the cabin fire, Clint and Marjorie met at a small diner 30 miles from the burned ruins. Dark circles shadowed both their eyes. Neither had slept much. Clint's clothes still carried the acrid smell of smoke. "I've got the cubs somewhere safe," Clint said quietly, wrapping his hands around a steaming coffee mug. "Friend of mine has a sanctuary about 4 hours north. They'll be protected there." Marjorie nodded, her face grim. "Kettering's not going to stop. That fire was a message. He's telling us exactly how far he'll go. Then we need to push back." Harder. Clint's voice had an edge she hadn't heard before. "You've been tracking his movements? What do we know?" Marjorie pulled out a worn notebook, flipping it open to reveal pages of careful notes and rough sketches. "I've documented suspicious activity across 3 counties. Unusual vehicle movements at night. Equipment that doesn't match any legitimate operation. But this," she pointed to a series of coordinates. "This is where things get interesting." They spent the next hour planning, speaking in low voices. Clint's military experience surfaced in his questions, analyzing patrol patterns, identifying vulnerabilities, mapping escape routes. The retired soldier was waking up by afternoon. They were hiking through dense forest toward one of Marjorie's marked locations. Barrow ranged ahead, alert for any sign of Kettering's men. The German Shepherd's behavior had changed since the fire. He moved with focused intensity, more combat dog than companion. "There," Marjorie whispered, pointing through the trees. Clearing opened up, revealing a collection of metal shipping containers partially hidden under camouflage netting. The ground around them was torn up by heavy vehicle tracks. Clint studied the scene through binoculars. "Those aren't normal shipping containers. See the ventilation systems? The reinforced doors. They're designed to hold large animals." They worked. They're way closer, documenting everything with Marjorie's camera. Inside one container, they found scattered straw and distinctive claw marks on the walls. Another held a collection of wildlife tags, all deliberately damaged to hide their origins. "This is organized," Clint muttered, examining the tags. "Professional. He's running an entire trafficking operation right under everyone's nose." Barrow suddenly growled, his hackles rising. Clint and Marjorie froze, listening intently. The distant sound of engines reached them. "Time to go," Clint said tersely. They retreated into the woods, moving carefully to avoid leaving obvious signs of their presence, but over the next few days, it became clear they weren't the only ones hunting. Kettering's trackers left signs for Clint to find deliberate markers that showed they knew where he'd been. Cruel metal traps appeared on game, trails some large enough to shatter a man's leg. "They're trying to spook us," Marjorie said as they disabled another trap. "Make us back off." Clint's face was hard as he studied the device. "These aren't just warnings. Look at the placement. They're hurting us. It's trying to push us into a kiln zone." One morning, Barrow barely avoided a snare that would have caught him at throat height. The German Shepherd's military training saved him, but the near miss left Clint shaken. He remembered similar tactics from Afghanistan, the steady escalation designed to wear down resistance before the final strike. "We've got enough evidence now," Marjorie argued. "We should take this to the federal authorities." But Clint shook his head. "Not yet. What we have proves illegal wildlife trafficking, but that's just the surface. The way he's operating, the resources he's using, this is bigger than exotic animals. We need to understand the full scope. They expanded their search, discovering more holding sites scattered across the region. Each one showed signs of recent use: fresh tire tracks, discarded supplies, disturbed earth where cages had stood. The operation was constantly moving, staying ahead of detection. The pattern began to emerge. Kettering wasn't just dealing in exotic predators. He was running a sophisticated network that used the animals as cover for something else. The shipping containers, the remote locations, the professional security, it all pointed to an operation with international connections. He's built an empire out here, Clint said grimly, studying their collected evidence one evening. Using the isolation and the corruption he's bought to hide in plain sight. The exotic animals are probably just a fraction of what moves through these sites. Marjorie's face was troubled. If you're right, we're dealing with something far more dangerous than we thought. These aren't just poachers, they're organized crime. Clint nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle onto his shoulders. The burned cabin suddenly seemed like just the beginning, a warning shot in what was becoming a much larger war. But he'd faced worse odds before. In places where the rules of civilization felt just as distant as they did in these remote mountains. Then, we better make sure we get it right, he said quietly, 'cause they're not going to give us a second chance. The rain drummed steadily against Marjorie's office window as Clint pored over the documents spread across her desk. His military training had taught him to look for patterns, and something about these shipping manifests didn't add up. The paperwork was too neat, too organized for a typical smuggling operation. Look at these dates, he said, pointing to a series of entries every 3 months like clockwork. That's not opportunistic hunting. That's inventory management. Marjorie leaned over his shoulder, frowning at the papers. These are supposed to be permits for exotic game reserves, but the numbers don't match any legitimate operations I know. Clint's fingers traced a line of identical entries. Because they're not tracking animals they've caught, they're tracking animals they've bred. He pulled out his phone, showing Marjorie photos he'd taken of the cubs. See their markings. There. Nearly identical. That's not natural variation, it's selective breeding. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. The cubs hadn't been orphaned by chance. They were products manufactured for profit. Their mother hadn't been killed in some desperate struggle. She'd been drugged, processed, and shipped overseas. Like Cargo. Barrow, who had been dozing by the door, lifted his head and whined softly. The German Shepherd had grown fiercely protective of the cubs, as if sensing their manufactured origins made them even more vulnerable. Here, Marjorie said suddenly, pulling a thick file from her cabinet. Kettering's property records. I've been collecting these for months, but I could never prove what he was using all that land for. They spread the maps across the floor. Kettering's holdings formed a patchwork across 3 counties' remote parcels connected by private roads and false front companies. The perfect infrastructure for moving contraband without detection. It's a production line, Clint said, his voice tight with anger. The holding pens we found. Those aren't just way stations. They're part of a breeding operation. He's farming predators like livestock. The scale of it was staggering. The cub's mother was just one of dozens of animals being cycled through the system. Kettering wasn't just profiting from exotic animals, he was manufacturing them, creating a sustainable supply chain for wealthy buyers who wanted guaranteed trophies. That's why the cubs were abandoned, Marjorie realized. They were probably part of a batch that didn't meet buyer specifications. Cheaper to let them die than waste resources keeping them alive. Clint's hands clenched into fists. The casual cruelty of it struck at something deep inside him. He thought of the cubs now, safe in the temporary shelter he'd built after the fire. They were learning to trust, to play, to be the wild creatures they were meant to be. The idea that they had been created solely to die made his blood boil. "We need to find their records," he said. "Proof of the breeding program. That's what will bring him down, not just the trafficking, but the whole industrial operation behind it." Marjorie nodded grimly. "He'll keep those close, probably at his main ranch house. The place is like a fortress, private security, surveillance. Systems, the works. Then that's where we need to go." Clint's voice had changed, taking on the hard edge of command he hadn't used since his military days. This wasn't just about protecting 3 orphaned cubs anymore. It was about dismantling an empire built on manufactured suffering. They spent the next hour studying satellite images of Kettering's ranch. Clint's tactical mind cataloged approaches, blind spots, potential vulnerabilities. Though security would be formidable, but he'd breached worse positions in Afghanistan. "We'll need help," Marjorie warned. "Even with solid evidence, Kettering has too many local officials in his pocket." "Then we go federal," Clint replied. "But first, we need those breeding records. Without proof of systematic abuse, it's just another wildlife trafficking case." He'll pay some fines and keep operating. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy silence broken only by Barrow's steady breathing. Clint thought of the cubs again, of their desperate cries the night he found them. How many others had died alone in the darkness, discarded by Kettering's profitable machine? "This ends," he said quietly. "All of it. The breeding, the trafficking, the whole operation. Whatever it takes." Marjorie studied him for a long moment, seeing the transformation taking place. The reluctant recluse who'd stumbled into this fight was gone. In his place stood a warrior with a clear mission, not just to protect 3 innocent lives, but to destroy the system that had created them. "Whatever it takes," she agreed. "Where do we start?" Clint gathered the maps and documents, his movements, precise and purposeful. "We start by understanding exactly what we're facing. Every guard post, every camera, every entry point. When we move on that ranch, we get 1 shot. We make it count." The mission had changed. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about justice. Kettering's empire of cruelty was about to face an opponent who knew how to fight back. And this time, Clint wouldn't stop until the whole system was torn down. The night wrapped around them like a heavy blanket as Clint and Marjorie crouched in the underbrush. Before them, security lights cast harsh shadows across one of Kettering's hidden holding facilities, a compound of steel barred cages disguised as an old logging operation. 2 guards at the main gate, Clint whispered, lowering his binoculars. Another doing rounds every 15 minutes. His military training took over, mapping patrol patterns and identifying vulnerabilities. Barrow lay silent beside him, dark eyes fixed on the facility. The German Shepherd's muscles were tense, ready for action. In the temporary shelter back home, the Leopard cubs would be sleeping under the watch of Marjorie's most trusted colleague. "Remember," Marjorie murmured, checking her camera. "We need clear evidence. Photos, documents, anything that proves what's happening here." Clint nodded grimly. They'd chosen this facility carefully, smaller than Kettering's main ranch, but still part of his breeding operation. The perfect target for gathering initial proof. They waited until the roving guard passed, then moved. Clint's boots made no sound on the packed earth as he led them to the fence's weak point. Barrow followed like a shadow, every movement controlled and purposeful. The wire cutters made a soft snick as they created an opening. Inside, the smell hit them first, the heavy musk of confined predators mixed with fear and neglect. Marjorie's camera clicked rapidly, documenting everything. There, Clint breathed, pointing to a row of cages. The sight made his stomach turn. Tigers paced in spaces barely twice their length. A clouded leopard huddled in the corner of its cage. eyes dull with despair. Every animal bore signs of forced breeding, scarred flanks, prematurely aged faces, the defeated posture of spirits broken by captivity. "We need to check the office," Marjorie said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "That's where they'll keep the breeding records." They moved carefully between the cages, Barrow alert for any approaching danger. The small trailer that served as an office stood dark and silent. Clint made quick work of the lock while Marjorie kept watch. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls. They worked quickly, photographing documents that revealed the horrible efficiency of Kettering's operation. Breeding schedules, sales records, genetic lineages tracked like livestock. A sudden bark from Barrow shattered the silence. "Company," Marjorie hissed, shoving documents into her bag. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness outside. They'd been discovered. Clint's mind raced through options as heavy boots approached the trailer. "Back door," he whispered, leading them out the rear exit. They almost made it to the fence. "Almost. Stop right there," a harsh voice commanded. Flashlights blinded them as 3 armed guards emerged from the shadows. What happened next exploded in fragments of chaos. Marjorie dove for cover as the first shot cracked through the night. Clint rolled, drawing the guards' attention. But it was Barrow who moved fastest. The German Shepherd launched himself at the nearest guard, a black blur of protective fury. More shots rang out. Clint fought hand-to-hand with another guard, his combat training taking over. Through it all, he heard Barrow's snarls, mixing with shouts of pain and fear. Then came a yelp that turned Clint's blood to ice. Barrow. The name tore from his throat as he saw his companion crumpled on the ground, red spreading across his dark fur. The sight unleashed something primal in Clint. He dispatched his opponent with brutal efficiency, while Marjorie managed to pepper spray the third guard. They reached Barrow's side as sirens wailed in the distance. "We have to move," Marjorie urged, but Clint was already gathering Barrow in his arms. The dog's breathing came in ragged gasps, his loyal eyes fixed on his master's face. They escaped into the forest just as police vehicles flooded the compound. Clint's world had narrowed to the precious burden in his arms, and the desperate prayer that they'd reach help in time. Hours later, in a veterinary clinic run by one of Marjorie's trusted contacts, Clint sat with his head in his hands. Barrow lay unconscious on the examination table, tubes and monitors tracking his fragile hold on life. The bullet had missed his heart by inches. "He's stable," the vet said gently, "but the next 24 hours are critical." Clint barely heard her. His mind was trapped in a loop of mitavines. If he'd been more careful, he'd checked the patrol patterns more thoroughly. If he hadn't let his desire for justice override his tactical judgment. "This is my fault," he whispered. Barrow had followed him through war zones, had adjusted to civilian life with him, had helped him save the cubs. Now his oldest friend lay fighting for his life because Clint had underestimated their enemy. Marjorie's hand squeezed his shoulder. "We got the evidence," she said softly. "Photos, documents, everything we need to start building a case." Victory felt hollow as Clint watched Barrow's chest rise and fall. The full weight of what they were fighting crashed down on him. Kettering's operation was vast, protected by money and influence. They were just 2 people trying to tear down an empire. "What if it's not enough?" Clint's voice cracked. "What if all we're doing is getting ourselves and those we love killed for nothing?" The steady beep of Barrow's heart monitor filled the silence. Outside, dawn was breaking over the mountains. But Clint had never felt further from the light. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Barrow's still form. Clint dabbed antiseptic on the fresh bandages, his hands trembling slightly. Each gentle touch, reminded him of all the times Barrow had been there through firefights in Afghanistan. through sleepless nights haunted by memories, through the lonely years of healing. "Easy boy," Clint murmured as Barrow whimpered softly. The German Shepherd's eyes, though glazed with pain, remained fixed on his master. Those eyes held such trust, even now. Marjorie entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one beside Clint and settled into the chair across from him. "The cubs are safe at the wildlife sanctuary," she said. "They're asking for you in their own way." Clint nodded but couldn't find words. The weight of everything, the cubs, Barrow's injury, Kettering's seemingly untouchable empire, pressed down on his chest like a physical burden. "Maybe we should just ... double quotes he started, then stopped, ashamed of the thought. "Just what?" Marjorie's voice held no judgment, only quiet strength. "Give up. Let Kettering win. Look what he's done already." Clint gestured at Barrow. "My cabin's gone. They know who we are now. We're just 2 people against his whole operation." Marjorie leaned forward, her blue eyes intense. "That's exactly what he wants you to think. But we have something he doesn't expect. Evidence. Real, solid evidence." She pulled out her phone, showing Clint the photos they'd taken. Breeding records, financial transactions, shipping manifests. Each image was a piece of the puzzle revealing Kettering's cruel empire. "These aren't just documents," she continued. "They're proof of systematic abuse, of international trafficking. With this, we can bring in federal authorities. People even Kettering can't buy." Clint ran a hand through his graying hair. His military training nagged at him. Never leave a mission unfinished. Never abandon those who depend on you. He looked at Barrow again, remembering how the dog had thrown himself between the cubs and danger without hesitation. "You're right," he said finally, straightening his shoulders. "If we stop now, everything Barrow risked his life for means nothing." Marjorie smiled, relief visible in her features. "So what's our next move?" Clint's tactical mind began working, analyzing angles and opportunities. "Kettering will be expecting us to lay low, to run scared. Instead, we press our advantage while he's confident." He stood, pacing the small room as his plan took shape. "We need to coordinate with trustworthy federal agents before he can move his operation or destroy evidence. But more than that, we need to catch him in the act." "The breeding facility?" Marjorie nodded. "If we can document active trafficking, ... Exactly." Clint's voice grew stronger. "One final push, with everything we've got. No more hiding, no more careful probing. We go in with full federal backing and shut him down completely." Barrow stirred, letting out a soft bark of approval. Clint knelt beside him, gently stroking his head. "Rest, old friend. You've done your part. Let me finish this." They planned meticulously. Marjorie made careful calls to federal wildlife authorities she trusted. Clint drew on his military experience, mapping approach routes and identifying vulnerabilities in Kettering's security. "We'll need to move fast," he explained, pointing to satellite images on Marjorie's laptop. "Once we show our hand, Kettering will try to destroy everything. We need teams here, here, and here, simultaneously." His fingers traced paths across the screen, marking entry points and escape routes. Each detail was considered, each contingency planned for. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about honoring Barrow's courage and ensuring the cubs would never know the fate their mother suffered. As dawn approached, Clint felt the familiar calm of pre-mission focus settling over him. This was the state he knew best, when doubt fell away and only the objective remained. He checked his watch, making mental notes of timing. 24 hours, he told Marjorie. That's how long we have to set everything in motion before Kettering realizes what's coming. She nodded. Her own expression hardened with determination. "I'll make sure the federal teams are ready. You focus on getting stronger." She glanced at Barrow. "Both of you." Clint returned to his vigil beside Barrow, but now his posture was different, alert, focused, ready. He took Barrow's paw in his hand, feeling the steady pulse beneath the little fur. "We're going to finish this," he promised softly. "For you, for the cubs, for every animal they've hurt." Kettering thought he could break us. A grim smile crossed his face. He's about to learn how wrong he was. The pre-dawn darkness shrouded Kettering's private airstrip in deep shadows. Clint crouched behind a cluster of boulders, his night vision goggles revealing the layout before him. Two hangars loomed against the starlit sky, their metal walls concealing the horrors within. His earpiece crackled softly with Marjorie's voice from her position on the opposite ridge. "Federal teams are in position," she whispered. 3 vehicles. Approaching from the south road. Clint's pulse quickened as headlights cut through the gloom. The convoy, 2 black SUVs, flanking a large transport truck, wound its way toward the hangars. Through his binoculars, he could make out Kettering's broad silhouette in the lead vehicle. "Right on schedule," Clint muttered. He'd spent hours studying the traffickers' patterns, noting how they moved their cargo in the quietest hours before. Sunrise. Now those same patterns would be their undoing. The convoy rolled past his position, and Clint allowed himself a grim smile. During their earlier reconnaissance, he and Marjorie had discovered the traffickers' own security measures, steel tire spikes that could be remotely triggered to stop unauthorized vehicles. Now those same spikes had been rewired to Clint's control. He waited until all 3 vehicles had passed the critical point. His thumb pressed the detonator. The night erupted with a sharp pop of bursting tires. The convoy lurched to a halt, metal screeching against pavement. Men poured from the vehicles, weapons drawn. Their shouts echoed across the airstrip. "Now?" Clint commanded into his radio. Floodlights blazed to life from multiple directions, temporarily blinding the traffickers. Federal agents emerged from concealed positions, their commands to surrender mixing with the chaos. But Kettering wasn't finished. He barked orders to his men, who took defensive positions behind their vehicles. Gunfire crackled through the air. Clint moved swiftly through the shadows, using the confusion to his advantage. His military training took over each movement precise, each decision instant. He disabled 2 of Kettering's men with swift, efficient strikes before they could even register his presence. A bullet whined past his ear. Clint rolled behind a fuel drum, scanning for the shooter. There by the lead SUV, Kettering himself. His expensive suit now dusty, firing wildly in Clint's direction. "You're finished, Harkness," Kettering shouted. "You should have stayed in your cabin with your mangy dog." The mention of Barrow sparked fresh anger in Clint's chest. He waited for Kettering to reload, then sprinted from cover to cover, closing the distance. Another of Kettering's men appeared in his path. Clint didn't break stride. A quick combination of strikes left. The man sprawled unconscious. Kettering must have sensed the net closing. He turned and ran toward the nearest hangar, fumbling with a keycard at the side door. Clint pursued, but pulled up short when Kettering spun around, pistol aimed steady. "Back off," Kettering snarled. "Or I'll make sure your dog gets put down." Properly this time, the threat hung in the air between them. Clint's muscles coiled, ready to spring. He'd seen that look before, the desperate calculation of a man about to do something stupid. "It's over, Kettering," Clint said evenly. "Federal agents have your records, your facilities, everything. You can't shoot your way out of this one. Watch me try." Kettering's finger tightened on the trigger. Clint moved before the shot could sound. Years of close-quarters combat training took over as he crossed the distance in 2 rapid steps. His left hand knocked the gun aside as it fired, the bullet harmlessly striking dirt. His right fist connected with Kettering's jaw in a devastating hook. Kettering staggered, but didn't fall. He was bigger than Clint expected, and despite his soft appearance, he knew how to fight. He charged forward, trying to use his weight advantage. Clint sidestepped, landing 2 quick body shots. But Kettering caught him with a wild haymaker that sent him stumbling. Pain exploded across Clint's ribs. He tasted blood. They grappled in the dirt, trading brutal shots. Kettering fought with the desperate strength of a cornered animal. He managed to get his hands around Clint's throat. Squeezing dot stars danced at the edges of Clint's vision. He could hear shouts in the distance. The federal agents still dealing with the remaining traffickers. No help would come in time. With his remaining strength, Clint drove his knee up into Kettering's solar plexus. The bigger man's grip loosened just enough. Clint twisted, breaking free, and in one fluid motion locked Kettering's arm in a submission. Hold he'd learned in combat training. Kettering thrashed and cursed, but Clint held firm. Slowly, inevitably, the fight drained from the trafficker's body. When federal agents finally reached them, they found Kettering face down in the dirt. Clint's knee in his back, his arms secured behind him. Russell Kettering, Marjorie's voice rang out as she approached, badge displayed. You're under arrest for wildlife trafficking, animal cruelty, attempted murder, and about 24 other charges we'll sort out later. As agents led Kettering away, Clint stood slowly, wincing at his injuries. Around him, he could hear the sounds of other arrests being made, of cages being opened, of justice finally arriving at this remote airstrip. Marjorie touched his arm. You did it, she said softly. It's really over. Clint nodded, watching Kettering being loaded into a federal vehicle. The trafficker's empire, built on cruelty and greed, had crumbled in a single night. Now he would face the consequences of his actions. And the animals he'd exploited would have a chance at better lives. Dawn painted the Montana sky in soft oranges and pinks as Clint watched the wildlife sanctuary's transport vehicle disappear. Down the winding road, the 3 leopard cubs, now safely crated, were heading to their new home. His chest felt both heavy and lighter at the same time. They would be cared for by experts, given the life they deserved, far from the cruel plans Kettering had laid for them. Standing beside him, Barrow leaned against his leg. The German shepherd's thick bandages were a stark reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. Clint reached down to scratch behind his companion's ears, careful to avoid the healing wounds. The vet says he'll make a full recovery, Marjorie said, stepping up beside them. Her usually stern face had softened in the morning light. He's tough, just like his owner. Clint managed a small smile. Tougher, probably. He looked at the scattered remains of his burned cabin, now just charred timber and ash. Yet, somehow, it didn't feel like an ending anymore. You know, Marjorie continued, her voice gentle, there's a ranger station that needs staffing, someone. With your skills, your dedication, we could use that. Plus, it comes with a house. Their eyes met, and Clint saw more than just a job offer in her gaze. He saw possibility, partnership, purpose. Barrow's tail wagged slowly as Marjorie knelt too. Check his bandages. The dog had taken to her over these past weeks, showing the same steady trust he'd given the cubs. Let me think about it, Clint said. But they both knew he already had his answer. Walking to the sanctuary transport before it left, Clint knelt beside the cubs' crates one last time, their spotted faces pressed against the bars, curious and unafraid. They were no longer the trembling, starving creatures he'd found in the storm. They had grown stronger, just as he had grown beyond his solitude. You're going to be okay now, he whispered, touching each crate gently. We all are. As he stood, Marjorie's hand found his shoulder, squeezing gently. Barrow pressed close to his other side, the 3 of them watching as the transport finally pulled away. The morning sun warmed their faces, and for the first time in years, Clint felt truly at peace. His fight for justice had given him more than victory. It had given him a new beginning. If this story warmed you tonight, subscribe and leave a single line that stayed with you. Your words shape tomorrow's story.